Welcome to the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. I'm Melissa Lieberman, a fellow IC and business coach. On this podcast, I teach you to become a consistently booked independent consultant without becoming a pushy salesperson or working 24/7. If I can do it, you can too. Listen on to find out how. Welcome to episode 113. Today, we're talking about how to convert speaking opportunities into consulting leads. So this is part 2 of a 2-part series. We started the first part last week, episode 112. If you haven't listened to that, you can go back and do that after this episode. But last week, we focused on how to land speaking opportunities to grow your consulting business. And today we're going to dive into now what? You've landed these speaking gigs and you want to make the most of them. How do you do that? How do you convert speaking engagements into consulting leads? And this is something that is so often overlooked. It often happens where I'm working with a client and they're so excited they've landed a speaking engagement or several speaking engagements. And then I say, great, let's talk about how you're going to convert those speaking opportunities, the people who are listening to you speak, how are you going to convert them into a lead? And oftentimes I get a deer in the headlights type look back at me. I don't know. I didn't think about that, is usually what I get back. And that is incredibly common. I do it sometimes myself. I know better. I speak a lot and I have the process in place that I'm going to share with you today. But at the same time, sometimes I make this mistake too of just not really spending the time to think about, okay, great. I landed the speaking gig. All of these amazing people are going to be in the audience or listening. Now, how do I get access to each one of them individually? That's what's so important. I want to help you avoid making the mistake of skipping that step or overlooking it or neglecting it or leaving it to the last minute. This part of prepping for a speaking engagement is incredibly important. When you're designing the content and writing the slides, all of that, you need to be thinking about all throughout that process, not at the very end, but all throughout that process. How am I going to convert the audience members into consulting leads? And I'm going to dive into this in a minute in more detail, but just to be very specific, when I say a consulting lead, what I mean is that you know their name and their email address so that you can start and build a relationship with them after the speaking is over, where you're not relying on the whoever is hosting you to speak to give you a list. Ideally, what we're talking about today, and I'll walk you through exactly what this means, but ideally, you've got people virtually raising their hand, theoretically, I guess, raising their hands. Doesn't have to be physically raising their hand, but they're really indicating, you know what, I want more from you. And that's what I want to teach you today. How do you get them to raise their hand and ask you for more? And by raise their hand, I mean give you their, at least their first name and their email address so that you can continue a dialogue with them. So that is what we're talking about today. I'm going to bring this to life with a lot of examples for you. But in the meantime, I wanted to set the stage. So that is what our focus is. Before we dive in, though, I thought I would take a moment here to just give you a really clear, crisp description of how I work with my clients. The reason why I'm doing this is a while back, I was listening to a podcast and I, was just kind of binging it and the information was so helpful. And I thought, I would love to figure out how to work with this person. Why do they have a podcast? Are there other ways to work with them? Or is it just this podcast? And for the life of me, I could not find any of that information without a lot of digging. I ended up finding it, probably took me 15 minutes or so, but I just want to make it really easy for you. I am a private coach who works one-on-one with independent consultants, helping them to grow their business. So whatever that means for you, whether it's grow revenue or grow the amount of free time and autonomy you have while still making the same amount of revenue or more revenue, whatever that looks like for you as an independent consultant, what your goal is. I work with independent consultants with those types of goals to help them really create a plan and execute against that plan and get out of their own way by understanding where their mindset is and their thought processes may be creating stumbling blocks for them or making it so much harder than it needs to be, and coupling that with strategy and tactics to really get where you want to go faster with fewer mistakes and really thrive in your practice beyond what you might have thought was possible. So, with that being said, if you are interested in learning more about private coaching, you can go to my website. The URL is icyourway.com. So the two letters for independent consultant, IC, then the word your and the word way.com. And we'll put the link in the show notes as well. So now that that's not a mystery, if it was a mystery to you, let's dive into today's focus, today's agenda. So, first, I'm going to start off with a couple of definitions just to make sure that as I'm sharing the strategies today, that it's crystal clear. And then I'm going to give you the basics on converting speaking opportunities into consulting client leads. And then I will wrap up with 3 or 4 examples for you. And then we'll talk about next steps of how to put this episode into action. So that is our agenda for today. Okay, so let's start off with what do I mean by speaking? I touched on this last week, so this is a little bit of a repeat, but I want to make sure we're on the same page because the term speaking conjures so many different images in our minds. And oftentimes the image is very, I'll use the word heavyweight, right? The image is us on some kind of a stage with a wireless microphone and thousands of people in the audience. It can be very overwhelming. Of course, that is one method of speaking, but there are so many others: podcasts, online presentations, webinars, panels, breakout sessions at events. The gamut is so wide. And so, as we're talking today, I want to make sure that you've got that context because speaking is so much more accessible than what you might be imagining that most of us do, like a TEDx talk or something like that. We're talking about so many different ways for you to get in front of your ideal audience and provide them with value by speaking to them about topics that they care about how to solve problems that they care about solving, or how to make them aware of problems they didn't even realize that they should be aware of. That's what we're talking about when I talk about speaking. And really, this is unpaid in this context. We're not talking about paid speaking engagements. That's a different topic. Right now, we're talking about unpaid speaking engagements that you can leverage to fill the top of your pipeline, your consulting pipeline, right? So that's what I mean by speaking. I'm going to go a little bit deeper on the topic of leads. What do I mean by leads? So I touched on this a moment ago, but a lead in a very simplistic form here is that you know the person's name, you know their email address, you know a way to contact them, you might know the company that they work for, but you have some very basic contact information then you can use to start moving them down through your pipeline, to start having conversations with them, to create a relationship with them, to ultimately have them reach out and say, look, I think you can help me with a specific goal or problem that I have. Or for you to be able to network with them and uncover opportunities that they may not have been thinking of using a consultant for. So that's what I'm talking about when I say the word lead. And it could mean, it does refer obviously to a potential consulting buyer, but it also could refer to potential referrers or potential subcontractors. When we talk about referrers, it might mean other vendors who work with your ideal consulting buyer. And those vendors could already have a relationship with your clients, your ideal client type. And so starting a relationship with them and cultivating a relationship with them, starting and cultivating a relationship with them can be incredibly valuable because then they think of you, the next time they hear that client telling them they've got a certain problem that you can solve for them. So those are the types of audience members that you would be speaking to, the consulting buyers, the referrers, the subcontractors, even, people you could team with. And we're talking about leads here in the sense of you getting their contact information where they've actively given it to you. They've actively said to you, here is my information in exchange for, and I'll walk into some details here about this here in a second, but I'm going to give you my information here in exchange for something of value. So let me now dive into what that means specifically. Now that we've got the core definitions in place here, leads and speaking, let's talk about the basics of the foundation, the fundamentals of converting speaking engagements into consulting client leads. Really, what your goal is from a speaking perspective is to get direct access to the attendees. First, you're getting the access to them, in the moment as you're speaking, or if they're listening to a recording, you're getting that initial access to them. But then your goal should be to also get ongoing access to them so that you can continue building that relationship that you started with them in the initial speaking engagement. Even if it doesn't feel like a real relationship, right? You didn't meet them directly, but they met you. They heard you speaking. They heard you giving them value with respect to the topic they care about. And so you want to have direct access to them moving forward so you can continue to build upon that relationship. That's your first goal of from a speaking perspective. So to drill down another layer of detail, you're going to want to encourage that audience, each individual audience member, to provide you with their contact information in exchange for some specific micro next step that helps them put what you're speaking about into action. So let me say this again in another way, because this is really the crux of today's episode. So really listen here. What we're wanting to do is get their contact information electronically. I'm not talking about collecting business cards necessarily, although don't avoid that. But also at the same time, we want to get their email information, their name, likely their company, if you can get that, and their email, their work email, where they've actively given it to you because they want to get more from you. They want you to give them some more value. They took away value from what you were sharing in the speaking situation, and now they want more. And I'll tell you some examples of how to offer more to them in a way that they're really going to want it. And you're not just stuck in this situation where you spoke at an event, you get the list. If the host of the event is even giving you the list, which is relatively rare, you get the list and you start emailing people, and it's a very low response rate because you're doing the cold outreach to them. What we're trying to do here is make it a very where they're seeking you out instead of you having to seek them out. I'm going to bring it to life here in a few minutes when I give you these examples. But before I get into that detail, the other thing I want to add to you is that you want to be owning your own email list. So if you don't have an email list, what I mean by email list is that you've got a system in place, an email service provider like ConvertKit, or you might look at it as an email marketing platform, is another term. ConvertKit's a really simple one to get up and running if you don't have one yet, and it gives you the ability to make a page where you put offer value to a potential client. I'll give you examples here in a moment, and in return for that, they put in their name and their email address, and then that system will accumulate those emails for you. And then when people unsubscribe or subscribe, it's handling it all for you. So just on a side note, in terms of tech stack, if you don't yet have an email list, that's what you want to be putting in place. Okay, so let's bring what I'm talking about. Now you've got the theory of it. Let's just bring it to life with very specific examples so that this is really relatable for you. So essentially what you're going to want to be doing in terms of converting speaking opportunities into consulting leads is you have the speaking engagement. When you're speaking, either in the middle, at the end, both at the beginning, the middle, and the end, wherever it makes sense, you're offering some kind of continued value in exchange for that audience member's name and email address. From there, once they give you that name and email, you're going to invite them to a next step. So let me tell you specifically what this could look like. So, an example for me, right? I did a speaking engagement, I think it was late last year, how to increase your rates, your consulting rates. That was the webinar that another organization hosted, how to increase your rates. At the end of that, when I went through all my slides and answered questions along the way, and we got to the Q&A at the end, on the Q&A slide, I also had, for more on this, go take my independent consultant's pricing assessment. You've heard me talk about that assessment on the podcast before. So I invited them to go take a pricing assessment, which, as I described to you earlier, was just a micro step to put what I was talking about in that webinar into action, make it applicable to them. So I offered a free pricing assessment in exchange for their first name and email, which, by the way, you can go take that pricing assessment if you want to. It's at IC, the letters IC, pricing.com. Anyway, that's a little plug there. So that's what I offered to them. And then once they took that pricing assessment, then I would invite them to a next step, such as a 20-minute assessment review call. So now we've got a direct relationship by them sharing their email. I know who they are, and they're the ones who gave me the email. I didn't get it from the organization that was hosting this webinar. And then from there, I was able to offer them first that micro step of take the assessment, and then the very next micro step of let's have a review call, a scorecard review call, or an assessment review call to go over your results. Or you can ask me any questions about pricing. So that's an example of what that would look like for you to convert speaking opportunities into consulting leads, where you've got that direct access and are building the relationship. Let me give you two more examples here. The next one is an HR consultant. So let's say an HR consultant hosts a speaking gig of some sort talking about how to lead high performing teams through volatility. That's a great topic right now. What are the recommendations on leading high performing teams through volatility? Or even just leading teams through volatility, right? That's their speaking topic. Then at the end, when it was Q&A or wherever it fits into the content, that speaker, that HR consultant would offer a leadership volatility checklist for high performing teams. So this example is like a PDF where they can really put into action the type of tactics and mechanisms that HR consultant was talking about. So it might be, giving them 20 more examples of how to lead teams through volatility. So it could be like an extension of what you're talking about, or it could be a way to drill in more deeply than you had time in the content that you were providing. So that's another example. It could be a PDF of that nature. And then once the audience member and put their name and email address and their company and consume that first thing, the PDF, then you might offer them a leadership volatility strategy session where you're really starting a conversation with them about what is happening in the organization as a result of layoffs and how do you get your teams back into a high performing state, especially when, they've probably never dealt with this type of situation before. So that's another example. Third example, you might be someone who works more in the business optimization type space, business process optimization. You might be speaking about a 3-part roadmap to increase SaaS customer retention by 20%. Especially in this right now, everyone's so focused on how do I protect my revenue? How do I grow my revenue? How do I reduce my costs? Right. So focusing in on, from a speaking topic, an example is that 3-part roadmap to increase customer retention. And then the next step in that, as part of that speaking engagement, you would encourage them to go take a customer retention assessment. And then after they take that customer retention assessment, as a next step, a few days later or at the end of the assessment, you would offer them a retention audit and strategy call. So that's gives you some really tangible examples. Hopefully you can think about how this applies to your business and what you specifically do, but it helps you to see where offering the audience members something of value that's very micro level that they're going to want to go download so that you capture their name and email. They willingly have given it to you so that then you can start providing more value to them and cultivating and building that relationship such that eventually you're getting them on the phone and networking with them, talking with them about the challenges that they have, and better able to uncover opportunities and qualify real deals that you can pursue. A few things that I wanted to share with you that you could use, few other examples rather after they're giving you the name and the email and doing that very first micro step, like an assessment or a PDF or an ebook or something very small. Then the next step, you may also, instead of a strategy call or an assessment call, you might invite them to some form of monthly lunch and learn that you host every month so that you're top of mind for them. They see that you understand their problems sometimes better than they might understand their problems, and they know that you're someone who could potentially help them. Another example, after they initially give you their email and name, you might invite them to a quarterly roundtable where you're pulling together leaders in a certain area, a certain function, I mean, and can really bring them together on a quarterly basis. So just be really thinking about what could this journey look like, this speaking journey look like, the audience members journey for you to initially add value to them through your speaking content, and then create these little breadcrumbs for them to start taking little micro step by micro step where you're consistently top of mind and able to add more value and build relationships with them. A few things before we wrap up here today, I wanted to share with you in terms of things not to do. I've tested these out before and they're not as effective. So I want to point these out. The first is, in the past, I have offered my slides as kind of that value. So I'm speaking and I say, well, you can go to my website and download the slides and capture their email address that way and their name that way. That is not as effective. You can do screenshots of slides, you can take a photo of the slides. It's just not very valuable to people. So, generally speaking, that one has not been as highly converting for me and other consultants that I work with, to give you some really specific examples, compared to things like assessments or PDF type checklists or other what are called lead magnets. And then the other thing that isn't typically as effective is telling them, to connect on LinkedIn. You can certainly say, connect with me on LinkedIn and get some inbound connections that way. I wouldn't discourage that, but I also wouldn't use that as my kind of pillar of how I'm going to keep in touch with these audience members and get a more direct relationship with each one of them, because you just simply don't own LinkedIn, but you do own your own email list. So you have a lot more autonomy that way and ownership of the data and the ability to, contact them through email and that sort of thing. So those are some feedback on what not to do. The other thing that I will add right before here we wrap up with the 3 steps to put this into action is to look at tools like the assessment tool that I use is called Score app. And you can create essentially this entire ecosystem I've just been describing to you through a tool like that. So it gives you the web page where you put in the name and the email address. The audience member would put in the name and the email address, and then it walks them through the entire assessment. It gives a score, and then it sends an email to that person and collects those emails for you. So it's all in one. And then you can integrate that into whatever email service provider you use, like ConvertKit. So we'll put those couple of tech tools in the show notes as well if you want to look at those. With that, let's wrap up today's episode, which is a little bit more technical than usual, but hopefully this gives you a really good sense of how to go create this audience journey to make the most of the speaking engagements you're landing. So go put this into action by number one, start that speaking pipeline. If you haven't listened to episode 112 yet, go back and listen to that so that you can really start landing these speaking opportunities. And then next, you're going to put this flow in place where you are converting your audience members into leads for your consulting business. And then finally, as I shared with you earlier, reach out for help. If you want to talk about whether coaching would be a good fit for you, you can book a consultation with me at consultmelissa.com. And my name is spelled with one S, Melisa, consultmelissa.com. So that's what I have for you today. Thanks for being here, and I will see you again next week. Take care. Thanks for joining me this week on the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. If you liked today's episode, I have 3 quick next steps for you. First, click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Next, leave me a review in your podcast app so other independent consultants can find and benefit too. And finally, to put the ideas from today's episode into action, head over to melissalieberman.com for the show notes and more resources to help you grow your consulting practice from your first few projects into a full-fledged business. See you next week.